Hi, I'm Travis Love, the Executive Director of the North American Elk Breeders Association, and we are proud to feature a webinar on regulatory considerations for new elk operations. This is a topic that receives a lot of interest at the NEBA office. We receive a lot of questions from folks that are interested in getting into the elk industry, and they want to know, hey, can I get into the elk industry? Can elk be legally raised? What are the rules in my specific state or province? And it's a question that we're happy to tackle and provide as much information as we possibly can, considering the fact that we have a very large membership base that we serve across North America. And that answer is going to vary from state to state and province to province, but we wanted to go over some basics of what you should know moving in and how to find out all the answers to your questions. So we appreciate it. And we are going to be sharing this on our social media platforms. If you know anybody else is having the same questions, please feel free to share this video with them, and we appreciate it. So we'll get right to it. So what is the purpose of this webinar? And as we mentioned, this is intended for folks if you're considering if you can own elk. Are you wondering about that? And again, that's a question that we get a lot. And the answer is state and provincial rules for elk operations can vary a lot. There are different rules for different types of operations, and we'll talk about that. But there is a lot of opportunity, but like any business, you need to do your homework before you begin. You have to stay organized, know your opportunities, know your limitations. A lot of planning is going to go into this, specifically if you're trying to be successful, and stay organized and take it seriously. Can't stress that enough. But there is a lot of good opportunity in the industry, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Disclaimer, this information is as current as of December 2020. The information may change, it can change, it will change. Every year, agencies, legislatures, the federal government changes its rules. So we need to be aware that this isn't going to be set in stone for years to come. It can change by next year. It's also not an exhaustive list. This covers most of the general consistent considerations we see, but that doesn't mean that a state or a province or even the federal government doesn't have something different. Doesn't mean that there's something new coming down the road. There's different implications for different operations types we'll talk about, but we do want to make sure that this is not just the things. It could be, but there's more information that probably has to be acquired. And then also, please, this is a requirement, check to confirm this with state agencies. Again, this changes a lot. We spend a lot of time studying the state rules and regulations, and even sometimes agency websites can be have to be updated from time to time within their own state rulemaking process. So always please confirm with your state or provincial agencies, the federal agency, and let's get started. So to answer the first question, can elk be legally owned? And the answer is absolutely. Domestic elk operations exist across North America, the United States, Canada. There's some in Mexico and across the world. But there are some exceptions with states and provinces we'll talk a little bit more about. Operations models vary greatly. And many operations across this continent are 25, 30, 35 years old. Many of them are brand new. You'd be pleasantly surprised how many folks call our office or buying elk farming handbooks that either just got into the industry or they're planning to get in the industry. So we have a very broad range of experience and business models. But again, as we mentioned in the disclaimers, know your rules, know your opportunities, and please know your limitations. So we mentioned that the operation type matters. And what we mean by that is, what is the purpose of your elk ranch? Why are you wanting to get in the industry? And hopefully you have all that kind of mapped out as you put together a business plan and financial projections so you have a successful, profitable organization. But the operations types do vary greatly. You could just have a breeding operation. You could want to focus on meat production. You might want to focus on antler production, that's velvet antler, hard antler, or both. It could be hunting, a trophy preserve, trophy ranch, or a combination of the above in different ways. So that's one thing you'll notice a lot. Everybody has a little bit of a different model, a different passion, and sometimes that is applicable based on what their availability is. Some states might not allow hunting ranch operations, but they're very prevalent in other states. Some states They just for whatever reason they have land restrictions, so they want to do something smaller. It's really up to you what you can do with what your business plan or what your finances can allow and what your state or province will allow. As an example too, why this is important to know this going in, because some states have different rules for trophy ranches and some do not. That's just an example. Some states have different rules for meat production. That is different from state to state. So you really need to know what you're going into before you go into it, because you might be subject to two different agencies. For example, if you are in the meat industry, there might be additional rules for meat producers, for food business, things like that. So it does matter, and really urge you to give that some strong consideration before you get in. Something else we thought would be really helpful is to just go over a few common terms. And this is going to be different. Again, if you're working with your local state elk association, then you can really get down to consistent terms. But we're the North American Elk Breeders Association. We're a national, international association. And so we're trying to be a little bit more general as we take a look at this from a macro point of view. But elk may be referred to in your state or state statutes, or if you Google elk operations in your state, you get the agency website. Elk may be referred to as elk. They might be referred to as domestic deer or domestic elk. They could be referred to as cervid, cervidae, captive cervid, farmed cervid. We see a lot of these different types of terms, and they could refer to elk based on what your state's definition of elk is. We hear the term breeders a lot, and we're called the North American Elk Breeders Association, but really we represent all elk domestic operations. The reason why we focus on breeders in the title is because we are the breeder registry for the industry, and that's a really big deal. And it is a huge part of our membership base. But you'd hear the term breeders a lot refer to all domestic operations, and sometimes with the exception of hunting ranches, but you could hypothetically just have a ranch of 10 animals. You call it a hobby. You want to hear elk bugle in the fall and just enjoy seeing a couple bulls with antlers. You might not consider yourself a serious breeder because you're not actively working on building genetic bloodlines or artificial insemination or anything like that. But be aware that you might still be referred to as a breeder just because you own the animals. Even if they're reproducing or if they're not, you might be called a breeder. So just want to let you know that going in. Trophy ranches could be referred to as a trophy preserve, a hunting ranch, a hunting park, shooter preserve, high fence hunting ranch. You know, we're not crazy about all those terms, but you do see them from time to time, depending on what state you're looking at or maybe which group's talking about the industry there. We prefer to say trophy ranches or trophy preserves, but you do see a lot of other names. In some of the names, for example, like a hunting park, you know, Utah, I believe, refers to them as a hunting park. So that, again, that can change from state to state, province to province. It all depends on those local definitions there. A few other terms, if you hear the word premise refers to as basically your elk location or facility. Again, take a look at the definitions. Devil's always in the details, but if you see that term, that's generally what they're referring to. Interstate and intrastate. This is something you'll see quite a bit when you look at your ability to engage in commerce or bring animals into your state or out of state. Interstate means they're going across state lines. Think of the interstate highway system. It's your highway system that goes across state lines. The ER is the kind of the key there. If it's intrastate, that means within the state. So if you were curious about your interstate movement rules, that means moving animals across the state lines. With intrastate, within the state, it means they're not going out of state. It's only, you know, from one end of the state line to the other. Same thing with interprovincial and intraprovincial. It's the same thing, just with the Canadian jurisdictions. Commingle is something that's important. Animals that are within a herd that reside together or are within 10 feet. It's an abbreviated definition of the word commingle, but that means those animals are together and actually will be classified together on kind of the same animal disease health risks. There are exceptions for herds that are 30 feet apart at all times. They can technically be listed as two different herds. The USDA CWD program allows that, but that is just something to be aware of as well. So it's kind of the easiest way to start is from the local level up. And because generally the CFIA rules and the USDA rules, we'll talk more about the federal agencies in a minute, are pretty standard, but it can vary a lot when you start to look at the state or provincial level. Most states and provinces allow for elk ownership of domestic elk, but those exact rules vary state to state. There are states that do not allow elk ranching. The state of like California, Washington State, Arizona do not allow elk ranching, elk to be owned in those jurisdictions. But there are a lot of states, the majority of states do, which is good news for us. In most states, domestic elk falls under the jurisdiction of the state agriculture agency. That is very consistent with what we see with things like bison ranchers and things of that nature. That could contrast, though, for example, white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer in most states are under the state agriculture agency, but there are exceptions where they're underneath the wildlife agency. But in the elk industry, it's extremely uncommon to see the elk operations under the wildlife agency there. Hunting ranches, however, may be subject to additional or separate oversight with the DNR agency. There's just, for example, if you're in a state like Kansas, it's all under the same jurisdiction. If you're in a state like Missouri, you're a conservation DNR agency will become involved when it comes to the hunting ranch side, and that is seen in some states. So just something to be aware if you're looking at more the hunting trophy side of the operation. How to locate your state and provincial rules? Well, these days, I think the easiest way is to just kind of Google it or search online and type in whatever your respective state is and elk ranching. Usually you can find it there. If not, go to the state agency website. For example, if you live in Kansas and if you're curious, then we absolutely say go to the Kansas Department of Agriculture, which holds that agency website there, search elk, and it should take you to the animal health division, and it will have usually a tab or a page or at least something, a button you can click on relating to cervids, elk, deer, domestic deer, something to those definitions that we mentioned earlier. If you live in Texas, same thing. Texas Animal Health Commission holds agency oversight. If you type in Texas Animal Health Commission, elk industry, or elk ownership, you should be able to find something to that nature. Federal agencies, there's quite a few of them. USDA APHIS, you'll hear that, APHIS, APHIS, and that is the USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. That is the reigning federal agency for elk owners in the United States. Its counterpart organization is the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, also known as CFIA. We did list USDA FSIS on here. That is the Food Safety Inspection Service. They're more involved on the meat industry aisles, but when it comes to our animal health disease regulations, we work with USDA APHIS, but when it comes to classification of meat inspection laws, meat labeling laws, that all comes from FSIS. So there are a few more out there, but these are the most common ones that you'll see. Operation permit and license. Again, almost all states or provinces require a licensed or permit for elk operations. So that is just the cost of doing business. If you're interested in raising elk in your state, you're most likely, I can't think of an example, you're not going to have to work with the state to get a permit or license, whatever they call it in that specific state, to have an elk ranch. There's an application to complete. It asks for the facility location. We call that earlier premise, the herd size, purpose of operation. The reason why they ask for the herd size is because the annual fee, which could be $50 to $200 per year, sometimes is on a sliding scale. Greater number of animals, greater work the agency has to do to kind of keep track of, and so they might have a higher fee. Not all states do this, but some of them do. There's a few other pieces of information they require. There's usually some type of annual report where you have to renew the license every year, repay those fees, and there are fines and penalties that exist for failure to comply. We're talking about state law. We're talking about state regulations. And when a person or a business is not compliant with a state law, that is illegal. So there are certainly fines and penalties that exist for failure to adhere to these rules. So back to the very start, we said, know your rules, take it seriously. There are some severe penalties for not following the rules correctly. Health program considerations. In some states and provinces, they may require enrollment in specific disease control programs. And this is pretty common with other livestock industries as well. Some states it's voluntary, some states it's mandatory, and it all just kind of depends on your operational type, and aspirations should impact the decision. For example, if you are wanting to move animals out of state, if you have people in mind that you want to sell to out of state, you are going to be subject to more regulation for moving interstate than you would be if you just want to raise a elk and never move anything off your place at all. If that's the case, depending on your state, you might not have a whole lot of programs to comply with. Depends, but it just all depends on your operational type. Here is one that you'll hear quite a bit about in the Chronic Wasting Disease Herd Certification Program. Chronic wasting disease is an extremely rare disease that can impact the neurological function of a deer or elk or a moose, and ultimately they call it a wasting disease. It's comparable to scabies in sheep and mad cow and cattle, comparable, not the same, but comparable. And this is a program that for the last 21, 22 years, the agencies have been working to monitor this disease in farmed animals and in free-ranging herds as well. What's called the Herd Certification Program, or CWD, is administered by USDA APHIS or CFIA. They're generally voluntary programs, but they may be required at the state level. Essentially what the program entails, oversimplifying this greatly, but you have to test all mortalities on your ranch that die over the age of 12 months old. Meaning if you have a 4-year-old elk bull and it passes away for whatever reason, then you need to test that animal for chronic wasting disease. Depending on the state, the test costs may be paid by the herd owner or the state. Again, depending on the state, you can, as a herd owner, may be allowed to harvest the sample. With a little bit of training, of course, they might have the state veterinarian or some representative come and do that sample harvest, or you could take it to your local DVM, as they are an expert at that as well. But the long short of it all is a chronic wasting disease herd certification program is required for your animals to move interstate. And actually, you have to be in that program for 60 months. So that program is required to move interstate, and that is consistent across North America, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It is not lawful to move animals across state lines if they are not in the CWD herd certification program for at least 60 months. You still need permission from the receiving state and everybody else and everything else, but this is there's just no wiggle room on this. This is a serious program, and you'll learn more about that at the state level. There's also something called the tuberculosis or TB and brucellosis certification programs. TB, which, as you know, there's several different variations out there, but probably something you've heard of. In the herd certification program for elk, they test all your animals for tuberculosis every 3 years in the United States and every 5 years in Canada. When you do that, you have what is called a accredited herd or a certified herd. Testing is the expense of the herd owner. It must be done by a DVM. There's 2 different ways to test for tuberculosis. In the United States, you can do what's called a skin test, or the common term, the blood test, which is the dual pathway platform test, every 3 years. In Canada, it's primarily the skin test. There is progress right now moving to allow the blood test. We hope that will be up and running by 2021. but they actually get to go every 5 years on those intervals. Again, two different countries, two different agency rules. Again, testing is at the expense of the herd owner, and certification is required to move animals interstate and international, if you between the United States and Canada, and interstate. Intrastate rules can vary from state to state, meaning if you're moving within to another ranch within your same state, it could vary. It's not the same between every state. A very similar story of brucellosis, which there's a herd certification program. Similar timelines we're just talking about, consistency with TB every 3 years for the United States, every 5 years for Canada. Brucellosis certification is a little bit more flexible. It's a blood test. You can be in the certification program, or in some cases, you can just test that animal before it moves interstate. For example, within 30 days before it's moved, you could just do a single test on brucellosis on that animal instead of the entire herd, like you have to do for TB. So that makes it a little bit more flexible. Good news is, due to the efforts of the North American Elk Breeders Association in partnership with other allied organizations, working with state animal health officials, many states are dropping this requirement. I believe 10 states have dropped it as of this month in the last couple of years, and several more as well. Brucellosis certification is still required to move animals and semen international, though. So there's a lot to this. Some of it's changing. Again, keep an eye out for the changes, because this is actually changing month to month right now. So moving within the state, check with your local, state, or provincial agency for movement permits. It's generally easier to move within the state than it is out of state, because you're only dealing with your state and not two. And also don't remember the federal government also has jurisdiction over interstate movement, interstate commerce. So whatever the regulation is in your state, if there is a permit to do it, great, get that permit. Sometimes it's just a movement form that they want to make sure that there's a movement form filled out for the seller, the buyer, and you got to give a third copy to the state agency. Don't forget to do that. Always keep copies for your own records, because if something gets lost, you want to have that backup. This rule is important for rule compliance, but it's also for traceability. Oftentimes people can get out of trace outs quicker if they have paperwork to show things. If it's more ambiguous, it creates questions, it takes longer. So again, follow your state regulation there, your movement permits, follow it to the letter, and you should be just fine. When it comes to interstate, there are more hoops to jump through, because as we mentioned, we're looking at two different states. We're looking at a federal agency rule as well between what's moving across state lines. Many states and provinces allow for the legal entry of elk. There are exceptions. There are states and provinces that have closed borders, meaning they do not allow elk importation. You want to know that up front. If you're in any of those states, or if you're planning, if your business model is to move animals to Joe, 2 states over, that wants to buy your animals, but his state's closed, then that's not going to work. You need to think about those things up front. I mentioned before, or the majority of states do allow for the lawful ownership of elk, but there are exceptions. There are states that allow for the ownership of elk, but you're not allowed to move animals into those states. Florida, as an example, you can raise elk in Florida. If you want to start an elk ranch in Florida, that's great. You can do it. You have to buy elk, though, from people within Florida to start that ranch. You can artificially inseminate from out of state, but you cannot move animals across the state line into Florida. So that's an example of a state that allows for legal ownership of elk, but its border is closed. Most states do not have closed borders, but some of them do. And it's just important to be aware of that. There could be other exceptions as well. If there's an interstate rule that will not take elk, if the seller herd, the source herd is close to a proximity of known chronic wasting disease or something that matters. So again, every state's a little different on this, just something to check into as you go along. Again, it is against federal law to not comply with all these requirements. We cannot state that enough. Do not try it. There are tough penalties, and we just don't want to see any of our members or any elk rancher or prospective one put in that situation. So always follow these rules to the letter. If you're not sure, wait, don't move anything. If you're not sure that you have all the necessary paperwork to allow you to have safe passage there. Let's talk a little bit about some of those details. You're going to hear a term called a CVI. CVI is a certificate of veterinarian inspection. And that in basically states will require within a certain amount of time, might be 14 days, could be 10 days, could be 30 days, that they want a CVI on that animal before it goes across state lines. And you will have to have a DVM come out to your ranch. They'll take a look at it, make sure the animal looks healthy. It's not about to fall over, it's alive, it looks healthy, and they'll sign that. And then that is part of what you need to go interstate. All interstate movement, as I mentioned, requires 60 months in the CWD herd certification program. Interstate movement requires TB herd certification. Some states require brucellosis test or certification, some don't. So that's kind of up in the air depending on where you're headed. Some states require an elk purity test. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. And some states require a wormer treatment. And there are a couple other things other as well. I mentioned this is an exhaustive list. Some states used to test for anaplasmosis. That's extremely uncommon now, but it could be common in a couple states where movement just isn't very prevalent. But those are examples of things you need to move. Now, we're not getting, this isn't inconsistent with other animal industries. If you want to move a horse across state lines or something of that nature, you need a Coggins test. So there are rules that have to take place, and these are the rules that are in place as it pertains to the elk industry. International is basically the same thing when it comes to interstate, but also you have this extra layer of federal rules, international rules that apply. These rules are listed on NEVA's websites. They get updated from time to time. So again, you always want to double check with your with USDA or CFIA, but generally they're pretty consistent and with what the state provincial rules are for interstate movement. So we mentioned the purity testing, elk and red deer and hybrid purity testing. Why is this a thing? Because elk and red deer can hybridize if they're together during breeding season. Some jurisdictions do not allow for red deer to be raised in those states, particularly states with a free-ranging deer or elk population. Just seems to be the consistent factor there, but that's not the exception. There's a lot of states that that's not the case, but some states that do require an elk purity test for movement as of now are Alberta, Colorado, Idaho, New Mexico, Utah, more of the western states. Oregon actually has closed borders, so it's not an issue there. The University of California at Davis is a university, a great lab that does a lot of such testing for different animal industries. They offer state-of-the-art elk purity test using DNA that's available through the North American Elk Breeders Association, and you contact the NEVA office to make orders for that test. It's a test that with NEVA, there's a fee. It takes several weeks. All of our website information talks about the different instructions of how to harvest a sample, how to get it in, but that is required for interstate movement for those specific states that require it. Some states it's not an issue at all, but some states it is. You can't go there unless you comply. It's part of the law. Elk meat sales is another example of something that may have additional rules. If you're selling elk meat, it's usually legal in almost all states. Not the case with white-tailed deer, but selling elk meat is usually legal, but there could be additional rules. If you participate in restaurants, you participate in farmers markets, just different things like that. You need to check with your local food safety agency, which is often in the Department of Agriculture, on what you may have to comply with for food safety rules. And also don't forget about the local government. Your city, your county may have something there as well. So elk meat is a growing industry. As you all know, elk meat is healthier, is healthy, high in protein, low in fat, low in cholesterol. It's a healthy red meat alternative. There's a lot of opportunity out there, but we want to make sure that you know the rules going in. So this was hopefully helpful if you're considering to get into the elk industry. A lot of times at our North American Elk Breeders Association annual conventions, we talk about kind of an elk ranching 101 seminar that's really intended for the folks that are starting, getting into it, how to better their herds. But for this, we really wanted to focus on the folks that are looking into getting into the industry, how to figure out what your rules are. We hope this was helpful. If you have questions, this is our information here for our corporate office. Our email address is right there. We're happy to get in touch with you. The North American Elk Breeders Association since 1990 is the trade association for elk ranches on this continent. We have a great history of working with members from all areas of our membership map, and we're excited to meet you. We're excited to help provide any information we can. There's also state and provincial associations in most jurisdictions that can also be a resource for you. So that is something to also keep an eye on. Unfortunately, we don't have them in every jurisdiction, but most ones with more active industries have them. They can be a resource too, especially when you focus on some of the more micro questions at this specific state level. So we hope this is helpful, and we hope to see you soon at one of our North American Elk Breeders Association events. Thank you again for your attention.